Hey guys, Happy New Year's! Hey guys, it is the last day of 2018 and I'm excited. I love the new year because I get to make a whole bunch of new goals for myself. Actually, I do that all year round, but it just feels more like people applaud me when I do it. But this video is not for looking ahead into 2019. This is for looking back on what happened in 2018, just considering my reading year, because it's pretty much all I did this year. I read 121 books. It was a lot. And I guess first I'm going to be talking about how I felt reading 121 books, because it's a lot and it was not how I thought it was going to be. I started out the year thinking, hey, I finally figured out how to do this. I was learning some ways that I was finally realizing that this was possible to actually read 100 books in a year. So that was my goal for this year. Get to 100 books, hopefully over 100. And then I got a full-time job working as a receptionist for a tax preparation company. My reading, I kind of stopped reading for a while. I continued reading as much as I could, but I also had school and everything was kind of taking over my life, and I just pretty much read school books that time. But in May, I was done with school and work, so I was able to just read a whole bunch. And then June came and I got a part-time summer job. Well, because I didn't have school, I had a lot of books that I read. And then school started and my summer job ended, and now I've just been reading for school because I have a lot more school than usual, and every single book on my school reading list are books I wanted to read. Since about June, my life has been completely consumed with pretty much only reading as many books as I can, pushing myself to the limit, and analyzing as many books as possible, just doing everything I can just to read and learn. I really enjoyed this up until about August or September, and then it started getting to a lot, and friends started leaving, and I was preparing for some changes in my life, my relationships. I started realizing how much time I was really dedicating myself to reading, and that I really don't do anything else aside from it. So my goal was still to get to 100 books, but by the time October was done, I think I was over 100, but I had to keep reading because all of my books were for school. So that stuff never really got fixed, but going into this new year, I know that I want to read less books. I used to read about 50 to 70 books a year, and that's what I want to go back to, because it did take a lot of time out of my life, away from my family and friends, and I found that I don't love reading as much as I thought. Which pains me, but I want to go back to that simple, just reading a book when I want to read a book for the book that I'm reading at that point. I will still be reading a lot because I read a lot, but it won't be nearly the amount as before. I got through a almost 1,500 page book in 6 days at one point this year. I read 13 books in a month, several months actually. I read over 10 books in several months. There was a lot, and I'm very proud of myself for getting this far, but I'm going to slow down. That's pretty much what I'm thinking of doing for this next year. And so my goals for 2019 are just read less, try to keep it to 5 books a month, something like that. Maybe a little bit more if I have the time, as long as I'm not putting it above everything else in my life. I'll read that many books. Also, I want to reread a lot of books, but then I always want to reread a lot of books at the beginning of the year, and I never do. I want to reread Les Miserables, the Tales of Ghostland Woods series, Harry Potter. I want to reread Wicked, the Princess Academy series. There's a lot that I want to reread, but there's also a bunch that I do want to read. Not any new books. I haven't really kept up on any book news, any book releases that are coming out. I mentioned in my Christmas song book tag that I had to actually go look up what was coming up for a question, and there were 2 books that sounded interesting: Heroine by Minnie McGinnis and On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. So those are 2 books I'm looking forward to. But other than that, new books I want to read are just books that have already been out. I want to read a lot more classics, but not like the refined. I used to think that I had to read refined Dickens and Austen and Shakespeare. I want to read George Orwell. I want to read Virginia Woolf. I also have found a new interest in nonfiction. I want to read a bunch of books about history, and I want to read essay collections. Those I am intrigued by so much right now. And then, of course, just books that have been on my shelf for years and I haven't read them yet. Like All the Light We Cannot See, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and A Branch of Silver, A Branch of Gold. Those are 3 that are like top of my list. But now that we've discussed that, I want to get into some of the stats for this year and how many books that I read, how many pages, what book, different things. I also just put a video up about all the books that I read this year, every single one of them. I just said the name of the book, the title, and the rating. So could be mundane and boring, but if you're interested, you can go read it. Watch it, not read it. Watch it. So let's get started. Each month I kept track of how many pages I read that month, and I added them all up together, but then I added up all of the individual books' pages together, and I found that they came out to 2 different numbers. So the overall year, I read somewhere between 30,000 and 33,000 pages. So that's how many books I read or how many pages I read for the entire year. But as for month to month, the month that I read the most pages in was in October, and I read 4,077 pages. But I actually only read 9 books that month, compared to the month that I read the second most amount of pages in, which was November. I read 3,739 pages, but I read 13 or 14 books. So there's a big difference there. There are 3 distinct months on here that I read a very low amount of pages, and that's because those are the months that I worked full-time, and it's February, March, and April. In February, I read 950 pages. In March, I read 872 pages, and in April, I read 873 pages. So I didn't read a whole lot in that time. I participated in 2 readathons this year, Booktubeathon and Banned Bookathon. For Booktubeathon, I read 5 books and 1,842 pages. For Banned Bookathon, I read 2 books in a measly 593 pages. Next, I want to talk about my star ratings. I found my average star rating was 3.46 stars, which was interesting. I thought it was going to be a bit higher because I felt like I was really generous this year, but it was actually on the lower end. I DNF'd 17 books, and for me, that's pretty much a 1 star. I didn't give any books 1 stars. If I am not enjoying a book, I will most likely put it down. There were a few books I didn't do that with, but not many. I only gave 10 books 2 stars. Then I gave 46 books 3 stars. I gave 41 books 4 stars, and I only gave 5 books 5 stars. But for me, I feel like that's a really good number because 5 stars should be held as like the best books on earth. And maybe the ones that I read aren't necessarily books that every single person would read, but 5 stars, it's going to be one of my favorites. And I think every single one of the 5, yes, I know every single one of the 5 stars are on my top 5 favorite books. Another interesting stat is that I read on an average 90 pages a day. Last year I read on an average of 30 pages a day, so I tripled that. But I didn't even double the amount of books that I read because I read 63 books last year. I was trying really hard to reach 126 books this year, but then I ended up getting burnt out and chucked it. Next, I would like to talk about the genres I read. I read 14 different genres over the year, and I'm going to start with the one that I read the most, and then the one that all the way to the one that I read the least. The genre that I read the most was fantasy, which I found interesting because I did not read nearly as many fantasy books as I usually do this year. I kind of got burnt out on fantasy halfway through of last year because I was reading the same kind of tropes in every single one of the books. So I started leaning more towards contemporary, and I figured I would have more read books this year than fantasy, but I didn't. I think the reason why is because I read Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia, and The Heroes of Olympus. So all of those were rereads, no new books. I think Wicked was pretty much my only new fantasy book. But contemporary was not far behind. I had 4 less books than fantasy did. I read 22 books. The next most read genre was classics. Again, it had to do with the Chronicles of Narnia. I consider the Chronicles of Narnia classics just because they're not modern books. I consider any book that's not modern to be a classic. So the books that I read entitled classic may not actually be classics. That's what I call them though. I read 16 books that were graphic novels. A lot of them were actually just fillers so that I could say I read more than I actually did. But a few of them I was legitimately interested in, like Quiet Girl in a Noisy World. Then I read 12 history books, and these aren't historical fiction. They're just books that are about a certain time of history. One of them was I read 2 times. It was Ancient Greece from Prehistoric to Hellenistic Times. Then I read 9 nonfiction books. I've never even read more than 2 nonfiction books in a year before. So, I mean, you can tell there's a difference now from this year to last year. Last year was a lot of fantasy and contemporary. This year was still a lot of fantasy and contemporary, but definitely leaning more towards just learning things and reading nonfiction. Then I read 6 historical fiction books, 3 dystopian books, which were just the Hunger Games series. I just reread that. 2 supernatural books, and then I read 1 from mystery, 1 from crime, 1 from thriller, and 1 from sci-fi. So those are all of the genres I read this year. And now we're going to get on to some of the longest books I read, some of the shortest books I read, some of the prettiest, some of the ugliest. I think this is going to be the most fun part of the video. First, we're going to start out with the shortest book that I read this year, which is Works and Days by Hesiod. The poem itself is only 33 pages long, so it was definitely the shortest book I read. Second shortest book that I read, though, was We Should All Be Feminists, because it only has 48. But you already saw that. So I'm putting it down. And then to go on the complete opposite end of the spectrum now, the longest book that I read was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and I've talked about this book seems like countless times. It had 1,460 pages in it. I read it in 6 days. The next longest book that I read was honestly probably the Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix book. I don't typically read books that are over 1,000 pages long. That is not my style. I honestly prefer short books, unless I know the long book is going to be amazing. Next, I want to talk about some of the prettiest books that I read this year. Let me pull them off my shelf for you, and then I'll show you. I've chosen 4 books here that I think are some of the prettiest that I read, and you can definitely notice a theme. They're very colorful. I'll show you the stack of them in the end. But first is Khirbet Khazeh by S. Yazar. I just love the stark white background and then the colorful picture of the Israeli desert in the back with all the very just the colors to just flow together so well. Blue, pink, yellow. Oh my gosh, look at that. It's so pretty. And then the spine is amazing and so pretty. Just look at that. I just love how all the colors just make a sunrise, or I guess you could argue that it's a sunset. I don't remember which one it is. And it's so simple and small. I love it. It may be my favorite cover of this year. Next, I already showed you again twice, but is We Should All Be Feminists. Just again, the stark whiteness of the background along with the colorfulness in the letters and the design with the yellow polka dots. And it just goes so nicely with the back, goes over to the spine, and it's such a simple concept. Another book that I found really pretty is Little Do We Know by Tamara Ireland Stone. I was not a huge fan of the book, but the cover, you can see that I like a certain style, a stark white background with colors just blown up onto it. You can see here there's a house here and a house here. It's upside down, right side up, and just really reflective of the story. The color splashes honestly don't have much to do with it, but I still think it's so beautiful. And the story itself is a very colorful, unique story. And then also underneath the dust jacket is just a plain green book. Usually I don't like plain, but this green is so beautiful that I die for it. And the next book doesn't necessarily follow the theme exactly as these three. It doesn't have a stark white background, but it is still very colorful. And also, it's set in Portland, Oregon, and I can see the Portland aspects in the cover. So, looking at it a bit closer, it's so pretty. Just look at that. It's beautiful. Next, I'll show you some of the books I found the ugliest that I read this year. I may have still really enjoyed them, though. I've got 2 books here, which makes me really happy because that means there's more pretty books in the world than ugly. Well, at least if this ratio is accurate. The first one is Need, and it's just kind of got a weird cover. I think everyone thinks faces on covers are weird. And then her face being blocked out with the word need. It's okay, but I don't know. It's a little weird. Just staring you right in the face. That's what she's doing. She's just staring at you. Staring and staring. And the other really ugly book is just Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. It was translated by Timothy J. Stephanie, and so it just has kind of paintings from that time. I'm assuming on some sort of architecture thing. It just kind of looks weird on this cover, and the font is also just the size of this book is kind of odd to me. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about my 3 least favorite books of this year, and then I'm going to talk about my 5 favorite books from this year. Hey guys, it's Emma from the future. This part of the video got messed up, so I'm coming back to refilm it. It's just like 15 minutes, so hopefully it won't be too painstaking. I think I can make it shorter though, and then it'll be less editing time, less watching time, and less time for me to sit here and refilm what I've already done. So I believe I just got done with all my stats, the longest, shortest books I read, the ugliest books I read, prettiest, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm going to get into my favorite part of the video, my 3 least favorite books, and my 5 top favorite books. I'm going to show you guys my 3 least favorite books first because, well, I'm going to try and get through them as fast as possible because I personally don't like that part. I know that a bunch of people do like listening to people's least favorite books, and sometimes I do too. Trust me, I like to complain about bad books. But I want to be happy with my reading year, so I'm going to mainly talk about my favorite books right after I'm done talking about my least favorites. My favorite out of my least favorite books was Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. This is actually an ancient Greek play, and the reason why it's one of my least favorites is because it was dull and boring, and I don't really remember anything from it. I listened to it on audiobook because no matter how hard I focused on reading it, it just wasn't working. And so I put it on audiobook, and I understood it better because it's a play and it's supposed to be heard instead of read, but I still didn't really retain anything. And even after I went and watched a summary video on YouTube to find out what happened in it again, I still couldn't figure it out. It was boring and dull, forgettable. Obviously wasn't like that for the ancient Greek audience because it's lasted this long. I don't know. Apparently it's good to people. My next least favorite book was something that I feel kind of bad about. It is Athenmara by J.M. Burroughs. This book I read last year, or I critiqued it last year for someone I know, a rough draft, and then I gave them my critique and didn't hear from her again until months later when I got this book. And then I went over and she signed it for me, but I was excited to read it again and find out what changes she made. And I read it, and there were no changes. Last year, it was my least favorite book that I read because everything was so underdeveloped and nothing changed. She didn't take any of my suggestions, which I don't fault completely to her. I gave her the critique kind of late, and I'm hoping to see that she takes my critiques with her second book that I'm going to be critiquing in a month or two. I don't know exactly when she's getting that to me. But yeah, there were some morality issues I had problems with in here, and it's not the genre I like. That's another thing. It's not the genre I like, so you have to think of it in that way. I don't like this kind of genre, but it's still, the characters were one-dimensional. I tried to like it, but I just don't. I had the same problems I had as before. And my least favorite book of the entire year is Enuma Elish, the Babylonian Creation Epic, translated by Timothy J. Stephanie. So I mentioned this is one of my ugliest books. It's also my least favorite book, so it's got nothing going for it. Everything that I said I disliked Oedipus Rex for, I also disliked this for, except even more so. I actually took the time to read it. I tried even harder to read it than I did with Oedipus Rex. There is no audio version, so I didn't listen to it. But it was even more forgettable, and I didn't like it. I ended up skimming through the last bit. I was not a huge fan. I don't know why anyone would be a huge fan, except for historians who are trying to figure out how those ancient people thought. I'm just not a historian, so I didn't like it. Now I'm going to get to my top 5 favorite books of the entire year, and I'm really excited for this because every single one of these books means so much to me. My favorite book is one that I didn't relate to so much, but it was just amazing, fantastic, and complex and intricate that it's my favorite book, one of my favorite books of all time. These other 4, though, I related to a lot and had a lot to do with the things I was going through this year, and I'll explain that to you as I'm showing you them. So my 5th favorite book of 2018 is The Unexpected Everything by Morgan Matson. Morgan Matson became one of my favorite authors this year with her cute storytelling and her voice. The settings that she usually I love the settings that she put in, and her romances are usually pretty cute. All the time pretty cute, and her characters, I like them. But The Unexpected Everything really got me, and I loved it. Part of it was just because of the cuteness factor, but another part of it is because of Andy. I really related to her character and one other character in it also, but I'll get more into that in a minute. Andy starts out the story with having a detailed plan for how her summer will go, and pretty much how that's going to help her down the line with her plans for the future. From the beginning, I found I really related to this girl because that's exactly how I am. I plan 10 years ahead down to how that's going to affect me in 5 years to 1 year, to how that's going to affect me this month and the months coming forward. How many plans do I have for the coming months? How many plans do I have for this week, this day? Sometimes I even go really crazy. How many things can I get done in the next hour? I'm obsessed. So when Andy's summer gets completely thrown off course, I was like, oh my gosh, this sucks. That's horrible. I could feel her pain and just how nothing was going right. And how was she going to come back from this? A lot of my future plans changed this year. Actually, like every single one of them changed this year. So reading this book, it was like kind of watching myself and what I've gone through for the year compacted down into a couple weeks for Andy. And then the other character that I really related to was Clark, not because of his personality, but because of also the situation that he was going through. He is a writer who's had writer's block for years. I was going through a similar thing, and while he was able to break through that and continue writing, I was not, because it was more than just writer's block. But it was also really nice to see a character that I saw the same aspirations in as in myself, going through the same thing and realizing that it wasn't impossible to come back from. This book taught me that it's really important just to roll with the punches of life, and that it can be great and fun. And I'm excited for this new year. I will never give up my love of schedules ever, but I'm excited to change my priorities. And because of this book, I have something I can now relate to. My third favorite book of this year is On Writing by Stephen King. I really liked this book because it sparked a love for writing that gave me the drive to try and do it again, which resulted in me finding out that I couldn't, which was an interesting process, but it helped. But also, it talked about passion, and I'm a very passionate person. When I get an idea, I go head on into it, put all my energy into it. And he encouraged that, and I loved it because I don't know, I wouldn't say it's discouraged, but it definitely wasn't encouraged in my life to do that. I love it when people go just full out for something. It's one of the most beautiful things on earth. And I saw that through Stephen King's story and this of how he started as a child plagiarizing just other stories, and how he went through college and was a struggling writer and he was published, and then he became huge, his married life and his struggles with drugs and alcohol. And then obviously he also talked about what writing is and how to do it, which I loved. Also, I had never realized this was the first book, and so far the only book that I've read by Stephen King, and I never realized what a beautiful voice that man has. And I'm not talking his physical voice, because I haven't heard his physical voice. I'm talking about his style of writing. It is amazing, just beautiful. I could just read those sentences over and over and over again. They're amazing. One of my favorite parts about the book, though, was the last chapter or two. I don't remember exactly how long it was. Stephen King was having trouble writing the ending of this book, and he said that was confusing. He had never really had this much trouble with something before. And so a couple weeks to this, he went out on a walk and he ended up getting hit by a car. And he was fine. He had to go to the hospital and he had a lot of injuries, but he ended up being fine. He started to have trouble writing after this experience. And I was reading this story of the things that he was going through as he was writing it. And I was like, whoa, that's exactly how I feel. I feel like I'm having a lot of trouble writing, not for the same reasons, but in exactly the same ways that he was. And that story and him eventually having the resolve to just sit down and write gave me the resolve to just sit down and write. Obviously, it didn't end the same way, but I still am very thankful for it, and I enjoyed it. I loved it. I will reread this book. It is amazing. That's why it's one of my favorites. I just realized I think I called On Writing my third favorite book. It's actually my fourth favorite book. This is my third favorite book. However, they could be switched. This book is Quiet Girl in a Noisy World by Debbie Tung. I never thought that a comic book would be one of my favorite books of all time, but it has become that. Everything that the character Debbie Tung, because the author just kind of writes and draws about herself and her experiences, is everything that I've gone through as an introvert. There were some other struggles that I had, but I'll talk about that a little more later. But purely introversion, I had these same exact struggles that she had, and I've never felt lonely at all because of being an introvert. Most of my closest friends are introverts. My best friend is an introvert, and we complain about society's expectation to speak all the time. But right before I read this book, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to just stop complaining and just start you know what? It's fine. I'm fine. I don't care what you guys say. Which I was already at that point pretty much, but I wanted to act like that and speak like that. Also, I was starting to come out of my comfort zone a bit. While being around people can still drain me sometimes, I have found that I actually love being around people more than I thought, which is alright. But I read this book as I was coming to these conclusions and things, and then I read it a second time and a third time, and it's been amazing. I love everything in here is everything that I've felt, and I feel like every single introvert should, every single extrovert too, honestly, just so that they can understand introverts. I really hate it when people bash you for being quiet, but whatever. I'm going to now show you some of my favorite pictures from this because they're all just so beautiful. This book definitely became one of my favorite books of all time. I've already gotten several friends to read it. It's amazing and I love it. My second favorite book of the year is A Quiet Kind of Thunder by Sarah Bernard. I loved this book because I related to it so much. I said earlier that there is another reason why I struggled with talking to people and them judging me, and it's just because I had some social anxiety issues. I'm not saying that I had the actual mental illness of social anxiety, but if it were a spectrum, I'd be pretty close. And I read this book and I related to the main character so much. And then on top of it, I saw her grow into a person that can get through her social anxiety, and I thought that was amazing because that's the same kind of journey that I went through. I also saw the cutest romance on earth, the most adorable thing ever. While that's a very simple combination and formula, it was something that created just the most heartwarming story ever, and I loved it. A lot of it was because I related to it so much. For my favorite book of the year, it is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Obviously, I've mentioned this book several times, but it is one of the best books ever. It's huge, ginormous, complicated and intricate, and thought-provoking. And I don't know how Victor Hugo, being a greedy, selfish man, created such a fabulous masterpiece, but it happened and it's amazing. As I said, I got through this book in 6 days, and as soon as I understood how to read it, the same as Tales of Goldstone Wood, I flew through it. It went so fast, and it was just amazing. I can't wait to read it again and learn more from it. I also watched the movie right after. I've seen it 3 times now, 4 times. It's amazing. Not as good as the book, though. All of the characters are third dimensional. The plot is a good balance between the old classic, just simple plots and the action adventure entertaining plots that we like today. Then along with the social commentary, it was just, and the history aspect of it, it was amazing. I loved it. After this big long video, just so that we can end on a happy, simple note, I'm going to just show you my top 5 favorite books of the year: The Unexpected Everything, On Writing, Quiet Girl in a Noisy World, A Quiet Kind of Thunder, and Les Miserables. Let me know in the comments some of your guys' favorite books or some of your least favorites, just memorable ones. I would love to talk about 2018 and the upcoming year 2019 with you guys, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.